Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath with Forbes Breaking News. There is a growing partisan divide among men and women in the United States, and this is especially true among people who are divorced. Joining us now is the man who conducted this research and knows a lot about it, Daniel Cox. He is the director of the Survey Center on American Life, and he is also a research fellow on polling and public opinion at the American Enterprise Institute. Daniel, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the top line finding. You found that 56% of men who are divorced say that they will vote for former President Trump in the 2024 presidential election. And that's a higher percentage than men who are married and men who are single. Did this result surprise you?
It did. I think for one reason particularly is that this is not a group of voters that we pay a lot of attention to. We pay a lot of attention to single voters, men and women, and married voters, but this divorce group of voters is not one that we really know that much about, and so it was surprising in that regard, particularly because the polarization between them was bigger than we've seen among other groups.
Talk about that divide. You say this divide is new, and I think it's something like 42% of divorced women say that they're voting for Trump. So what is causing this divide?
So I think there's a number of things that I would point to. One is that we did some polling that found that the issue of divorce is particularly resonant among men who think that they're at a disadvantage in American society today. There's a growing number of men who feel this way. And we asked the question of whether Americans thought that men or women are more advantaged by the justice system when it comes to divorce. Do divorce courts treat men or women better? And men overwhelmingly believe, all men, but particularly divorced men, believe that divorce courts favor women in their proceedings. And so I think that experience of going through divorce and dealing with lawyers and possibly court proceedings plays into this worldview where men believe that they're increasingly on the defensive.
Plays into a worldview where men believe they're on the defensive. Let's dive into that a little bit more. How exactly do they think that divorce courts are not addressing their needs? And also, how do they think the two presidential candidates will play to their needs? What has former President Trump proposed that this constituent of voters want to see in American society?
Well, I don't think it has to do with any particular policy, particularly when we're talking about this issue. But I do think it has a lot to do with Trump sort of hearing them and expressing their frustrations and even some amount of grievance about how American society has shifted so quickly and dramatically to represent the interests of women in a lot of situations, but then forgotten the challenges that men face. And you saw this actually shortly after the Me Too movement, when there was all this concern about this ongoing, really significant problem with sexual harassment and assault in the United States. And one of the first things Trump said is like, well, what about the men? Like, we should be mindful of how the situation could impact their lives.
Interesting. So does this divide start with the Me Too movement, or does it predate 2017?
Well, a lot of things that we've seen in the polling data seem to originate around 2016, 2017. And I'll share just two trends with you, which I think are really compelling. The first is that for young women, they become increasingly liberal around that time. And so the gender divide among Gen Z occurs 2016, 2017, and expands shortly thereafter. And so you have young women becoming much more liberal and young men kind of remaining the same. The other thing that happens around that same time period is women become increasingly dissatisfied with the way women are being treated in American society. Gallup has polls going back roughly 2 decades where asked, are you satisfied with the way women are treated? And for the most part, men and women were feeling fairly okay. But again, around 2016 and around 2017, there's a precipitous decline in how women are feeling, whereas men don't show much evidence of change at all.
That's interesting, and it kind of makes sense if you've been following political news that it goes back to that moment in time, 2016. So you mentioned Gen Z. I want to break down the demographics of your research. So it was 56% of men who are divorced say they are voting for Trump. Let's start with age demographics. How does that change among Gen Z, Millennial, Gen X, and Boomer men? Is it 56% across the board, or is one of those age groups higher than another?
So one of the fascinating things is that the political gender divide is, you see it across generations, right? That historically men have been somewhat more Republican and conservative than women, and you can see that in their voting records. But among this generation, we're seeing a 17-point, 18-point political divide in their candidate choice, which is much smaller among older generations. So the Gen Zers are seeing are in far different places, men and women, than they are among millennials and Gen X and baby boomers, even if overall some of those folks are more conservative.
So say that one more time. Is the gender divide is greatest among Gen Z and not boomers? Did I hear that right?
Yeah, so the gender divide is definitely larger among Gen Z than it is among older generational cohorts, even if the baby boomers overall, men and women, are slightly more Republican and more conservative than younger. The gap is bigger. And I think part of the reason is that young women are so much more liberal and democratic.
And I imagine, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but this creates a vicious cycle wherein there is a divide in political opinions. And then if people feel like they can't talk to each other, does that exacerbate the divide? Have you found a worsening effect in your research?
Yeah, we found in some of our research when it comes to dating and relationships and even friendships that younger liberal women in particular report some sense of aversion and hesitancy to date even moderate men, but particularly conservative men. And one of the really fascinating things is that when you look at a whole number of political issues, from gun control and abortion and climate change and healthcare, single women and young women tend to care about these issues a lot, and young men seem not simply more conservative, but much more apathetic.
And what about demographic differences in your research across ethnic categories? So Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, Island Pacific Americans. Is the divorce divide present among those groups too, or how did that break down in your research?
Yeah, we weren't able to disaggregate racial and ethnic differences in the marital divide, but overall, you do see significant gender divides among each of those different racial and ethnic groups, but it's most pronounced among white Americans.
Most pronounced among white Americans. Now, the Brookings Institute had a report that came out this week that said the gender divide could decide the election in states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Nevada. What's your opinion? Does your research also support that conclusion? And I should note that they were looking at turnout and not necessarily partisan feelings, but of course there's a correlation. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so this is something that is really hard to know at this point because turnout is the big thing. We know kind of where some of these subgroups are gonna land, but when it comes to turnout, we know historically women turn out at higher rates than men, and particular subgroups the gap is even larger. So among single women, for instance, in 2020, there's roughly a 10-point difference between how many single women turned out versus how many single men. And if we're seeing those kinds of disparities, given how strongly single women tend to support Democratic candidates, it could absolutely decide close races.
So that's on the single side. How much will the divide among divorced people affect November's election? Are you able to say or to hypothesize?
I mean, it's hard because we don't have the demographic data by state and county. So, we are running a national election, but the results really matter in particularly close states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Nevada, Michigan. And so to the extent that there are large gender gaps there among people who are divorced, it will matter a great deal. I mean, the other thing too, just to remember in all this, is that when it comes to the divorce category, that can be a temporary category for a lot of people. So men are much more likely to get remarried than women, while women are much more likely to remain single. And the experience, I think, really changes your political perception and political priorities. Single women have very different political priorities than married women, for obvious reasons, like the gender pay gap is a much more substantial problem for you if you are responsible for paying, everything yourself, the rent, groceries, utilities. The fact that you were being paid less is a much bigger deal. So I think those kinds of things make the experience of being a single woman, put them in a very different political space.
It's interesting that you say that. Of course, there's reporting from Wells Fargo that indicates the wealth gap among men and women is affected by marriage. Even if you get married and then get divorced, those women have greater wealth than women who are never married. So there are political implications, there are wealth implications, and you are writing a book about the gender divide in America. So I'd love to zoom out and talk about this, because is it just divorce, or are there other qualifying life events, in the words of the insurance industry, that affect people's political affiliations and the way that they vote?
Yeah, I mean, I think the formative experiences of young people is just qualitatively different today than it was a generation earlier. So young people today are far less likely to date. They're far less likely to be a part of regular civic or religious activities that brings people together, women and men. And so what you have is far fewer opportunities to socialize and, as a result, empathize with someone of the opposite sex. Like you just have fewer experiences. And because so much of the formative experiences of young people is occurring online, it's migrated to social media, which is incredibly divisive and prone to putting out the most extreme information on regarding gender and gender dynamics. I think it further polarizes young people. You're hearing online, whether it's TikTok or Instagram, young women complaining about dates or their husbands, and vice versa, and that is being fed algorithmically to young people who are saying, like, wow, I guess dating's pretty terrible, or I guess maybe marriage isn't for me because I'm much more comfortable on my own or with my friends. And so this experience has a profound impact, obviously, on what they think about relationships and marriage, but also what they think about politics, because we also know that young people are going to be single for a much longer period of time, with people getting married in their late 20s and early 30s. And that, again, that experience of living on your own, having to fend for yourself, puts you in a very different space. And there's a vulnerability there, I think, particularly for women who, in the conversations we've had with them in focus groups and other places, talk a lot about safety and security. And again, that's a very different conversation we're having with single women than married women.
And you recently collaborated with the Washington Post on an op-ed where you actually have these handwritten letters from men and women, it looked like predominantly from Philadelphia, about what they wanted the opposite sex to know about their experience. Can you summarize what you found in this exercise, or perhaps what was most surprising to you among the letters you received?
Yeah, we ran a series of 7 different focus groups gender segregated among men and women under the age of 34. And at the end of conversations that touched on politics and voting, on dating, marriage, infidelity, pornography, we asked each participant to fill out a postcard that we work with the Washington Post on. And the question was, what do you wish men understood about women? And for the women, we said, what do you wish women understood about men? And the responses were really illuminating, somewhat sad for some of them. We had just feelings of wanting to be understood, that the women would say, I wish men understood that they never have to worry about walking alone down a dark street, that we always have to be on our guard, that we are never 100% safe, that we're always working so hard to get where we are, and we have so many obstacles. And the men were saying, remarkably similar things, that they wish that the young women understood how difficult they had it, that sort of pressures of succeeding and being a provider were harder than ever. The economy, was working against them, but there were still all these expectations for them in terms of what they have to do as men, and that they didn't feel like anyone had their back. And this, we saw this in a number of different comments where people were really honest. And for listeners and viewers, I would encourage to check out that Washington Post site, because it's really to read those comments, I think is really kind of startling, and hopefully I would hope it's helpful for folks to understand where young men and women are.
It was interesting because across all the postcards, it felt like both sides were feeling like they are not being heard by the other side. In the different experiences, there's almost that universal sense that no one understands them. So I'm wondering, I know you're researching still and you're writing your book, but are there solutions? And with the caveat that there will probably always be political divides, but in terms of the loneliness, in terms of the not hearing each other, are there policy recommendations or societal recommendations that you would make at this point?
So I think it's hard to sort of change culture through policy, but I think there are some ways that we can identify the problems. And I think the amount of time and the age at which young people are getting smartphones and spending time on social media is taking them away from other opportunities to socialize, to be around all sorts of people, but particularly developing relationships with people of the opposite gender who do have qualitatively very different experiences living in the United States. And so if we could encourage greater civic involvement, community activities where young people can come together in sort of the same geographic space, spend less time online, where again you have social media can create a lot of divisions. So I think that would be my first recommendation, is sort of limit how early people are on social media and encourage more in-person interactions.
And then, based on your research and this polling, what is your message to either former President Trump about how he speaks to female voters, or Vice President Harris in terms of how she appeals to male voters?
Yeah, well, I think this is a whole other problem, is our political parties have polarized, I think, to the point where to help women, it seems to be coded as Democrat or liberal, and to help men is coded as Republican or conservative. In the same survey that we did, that we looked at some of these gender differences that I earlier mentioned, we asked this question whether American society is doing enough to help boys become successful adults, and to the extent that we need to do more to help girls become successful adults. And Trump voters are far more likely to say that we should help boys and not girls, and Harris voters are somewhat more likely to say that we should help girls and not boys. And I think that's part of the problem, right? That the rhetoric needs to reflect that both young men and young women have challenges they have in their life. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're distinct because they're men or women, and we need to have a conversation that reflects that and is sensitive to that we can help men without excluding girls, and we can young women and girls, and we can help girls and young women without excluding men.
Do you fear that November's election could worsen the political divide among men and women? If 2016 was an inflection point that kind of helped catalyze this divide, could 2024 worsen it?
I mean, I hope not, but that's certainly a possibility. In a close election, every group of voters is going to be pivotal. And one thing I worry about is if we do see this divergence in voting among young people, with young women voting strongly for Harris and young men leaning more towards supporting Trump, that there could be the blowback if Trump wins from a lot of young women who really despise the former president could be significant. And it again, Trump is an incredibly polarizing figure when it comes to gender, given his history, given his rhetoric, that I think you could see, if that's the outcome, there could be an exacerbation of the gender divide.
We've covered a lot of ground, Daniel, but is there anything else we should know about your research and your polling on American society and the gender divide in the run-up to the election, which is less than a month away at this point?
I think the one thing I would note is that we're talking a lot about politics in general. Obviously, we're weeks out from a really critical election. But when you think about the gender divide, it's much more about politics. It's as much about relations and relationships. And that is something that I think, is going to have really considerable societal impact down the road when you think about marriage rates and the birth rates. I mean, that's all going to be impacted on the extent to which men and women can get along.
Daniel Cox, director of the Survey Center on American Life, thank you so much for joining us and breaking down your research findings. I hope you'll come back because this is an endlessly important and interesting topic.
Thanks for having me.